Bitter winds howl through Wyoming's Blackhorn Mountains, where Sarah Winters' dream of being a rural schoolteacher is about to collide with nature's fury. Miles from civilization, her borrowed wagon breaks an axle in the worst blizzard in 40 years. With temperatures plummeting and wolves circling in the darkness, she stumbles upon the only light for 20 miles. A cabin belonging to James Cooper, a man who left civilization behind after losing everything he held dear. In the flickering candlelight of that fateful night, two souls scarred by life's hardships find an unexpected connection. As the blizzard rages outside, Sarah's gentle persistence begins to thaw James's frozen heart, reminding him of everything he thought he'd lost forever. But can love bloom in a single night of survival? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather portfolio containing Sarah Winters' teaching certificate had traveled 1,500 miles from Boston, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the elements. Now, as she drew her woolen shawl tighter against the cutting wind, that precious document lay secure in her carpet bag, a testament to everything she'd left behind and everything she hoped to build. 3 months earlier, she had stood in her father's book-lined study, her spine straight as the marble mantelpiece behind her. "Sarah," he'd said, peering over his wire-rimmed spectacles, "this foolish notion of teaching in the territories must end. You're 26 now. The Appleton boy has shown interest. It's time to consider a suitable marriage." But Sarah had already made her choice. The moment she'd seen the advertisement in the Gazette, "Teacher wanted, Wyoming Territory, room, board, and $28 monthly," something had sparked in her soul. It wasn't the money. Heaven knew she could earn more teaching at any number of Boston's private academies. It was the promise of purpose, of building something meaningful in a place where education could make the difference between prosperity and poverty. Her mother had wept, of course. "You'll freeze to death in that wilderness," she'd predicted, pressing a fur muff into Sarah's hands. Or worse, marry some uncouth settler who's never seen the inside of an opera house. The muff now lay abandoned in her trunk back at the schoolhouse, too fine for the practical reality of frontier life. The journey west had stripped away every pretense of gentility, first by rail, watching the manicured gardens of Massachusetts give way to the vast prairies, then by stagecoach, learning to sleep sitting upright as they bounced through Kansas territory. Finally, by wagon into Wyoming's high country, where the air grew thin and sharp as a knife's edge. The schoolhouse in Blackhorn Valley wasn't what she'd imagined. No neat white clapboard building with a bell tower, but a rough-hewn log structure, with a dirt floor and windows made from oiled paper. Her pupils arrived on horseback or on foot, some traveling 10 miles through all weather. They brought payment in eggs, firewood, or fresh game when money was scarce. Sarah learned to accept whatever was offered with grace. What the building lacked in refinement, her students made up for in eagerness to learn. 8-year-old Tommy Larson, who'd never held a pencil before September, now wrote his name in careful block letters. Mary Beth Wilson, at 12 already, responsible for her 4 younger siblings, devoured every book Sarah could provide, reading by candlelight after her chores were done. More than the teaching itself, Sarah found herself transformed by the raw beauty of the landscape. The mountains wore different colors for every season: autumn gold, winter white, spring emerald. Even now, with December winds howling down, from the peaks there was majesty in their severity. She'd never felt more alive, more certain of her place in the world. When the school board chairman had handed her that first month's wages, $28 in carefully counted silver coins, she'd felt a pride that no Boston society compliment could match. This was money she'd earned through her own merit, teaching children who truly needed what she could give them. If only she'd heeded the warning signs of the gathering storm, the way the sheep had huddled close to the ground that morning, the unusual stillness in the air. But she'd been so determined to deposit those wages at the Territorial Bank in Preston's Crossing, to prove to herself and her family that she could make her own way in the world. Now, as the first heavy flakes began to fall, Sarah clutched her carpetbag closer. The teaching certificate inside represented more than just her qualifications. It was proof that a woman could choose her own path, even if that path led her into the heart of a Wyoming winter. What she didn't know, as she urged her tired horse forward, was that the real test of her courage was only beginning. The first sharp crack came without warning. Sarah pulled back on the reins, straining to hear over the howling wind. The borrowed wagon, Mr. Peterson's pride, with its fresh-painted wheels and sturdy oak bed, shuddered beneath her. Another crack, this one louder, followed by the sickening sound of splintering wood. "Whoa there, easy now," she called to the horse, her voice barely carrying through the thickening snow. The wagon lurched violently to one side, and she knew, without looking, that the rear axle had given way. All those careful warnings from the livery stable keeper came flooding back. "Mind them ruts in the mountain track, Miss Winters. This storm weather makes the wood brittle as old bones." The horse, a steady bay gelding named Chester, stamped nervously in the deepening snow. Sarah wrapped the reins around her mittened hands and forced herself to think clearly. The temperature was dropping faster than a stone in a well, and Preston's Crossing lay at least 10 miles behind her. The schoolhouse, her intended destination, was another 8 miles ahead, assuming she hadn't strayed from the trail. Climbing down from the wagon seat, Sarah sank knee-deep in snow. The wind cut through her heavy skirts like they were made of gossamer, and her teeth began to chatter despite her determination to stay calm. The broken axle jutted from beneath the wagon at an impossible angle. The wood split clean through. No amount of frontier ingenuity could fix this, not in these conditions. She had matches in her carpetbag and a small tin of beans she'd purchased in town. But starting a fire in this wind would be near impossible, and the surrounding pine trees offered little shelter from the strengthening storm. Already, the falling snow had begun to erase her tracks, leaving only unbroken white in every direction. A long, mournful howl echoed across the valley, raising the hair on the back of her neck. Wolves. They'd been growing bolder as winter deepened, venturing closer to settled areas in search of food. Chester snorted and pulled at his harness, rolling, his eyes in fear. "We can't stay here," Sarah muttered, as much to herself as to the frightened horse. She managed to unhitch Chester from the ruined wagon, her fingers clumsy with cold. The basic supplies she could carry, her carpetbag, the tin of beans, a rough blanket from the wagon seat, she tied securely to the saddle. Everything else would have to be abandoned. The silver coins from her wages, sewn carefully into the hem of her dress that morning, felt like a lead weight now. What good was money in this vast whiteness? She would have traded every cent for the certainty of shelter. Another howl, closer this time, was answered by several others. The wolf pack was on the move, drawn perhaps by the scent of horse and human fear. Sarah pulled herself into the saddle, grateful now for the riding lessons her father had insisted upon in more genteel days. Chester pranced beneath her, sensing the danger. "Forward," she commanded, trying to infuse her voice with a confidence she didn't feel. But which way was forward? The swirling snow had transformed the familiar mountain trail into an alien landscape. Every boulder, every stand of trees looked the same, wrapped in winter's deadly blank canvas. The wind picked up, driving ice crystals against her face like tiny needles. Sarah bent low over Chester's neck, trying to share what little warmth remained between them. Her mother's dire predictions echoed in her mind. "You'll freeze to death in that wilderness." The words had seemed melodramatic in Boston's warm parlor. Now they carried the weight of prophecy. Through the gathering darkness, something caught her eye, a flicker of yellow barely visible through the curtain of snow. It could be a will-o'-the-wisp, those phantom lights that supposedly led travelers to their doom. Or it could be a cabin's lamp, a beacon of hope in the storm. Chester, had spotted it too, his ears pricking forward. Before Sarah could decide whether to trust this potential salvation, another chorus of howls split the air, much closer than before. The decision was made for her. She turned the horse toward the distant light and gave him his head. "Please," she whispered, the word freezing in the air before her. "Please, let it be real." As they pushed forward through deepening snow, Sarah realized she was no longer certain whether she was praying for shelter or merely for the strength to face whatever lay ahead. James Cooper stood at his cabin's window, watching the storm transform the familiar contours of his mountain home into something otherworldly. The brass medal in his calloused hand caught the lamplight, its surface dulled by years of being handled. In moments like these, when the silence grew too heavy to bear, the inscription had worn thin. "For valor, Battle of Gettysburg, 1863. 12 years had passed since that blood-soaked Pennsylvania field, but some nights the memories were as fresh as yesterday's tracks in the snow. He'd been a lieutenant, then leading men barely old enough to grow whiskers into the maw of Confederate artillery. After the war, he'd tried returning to his family's shipping business in Philadelphia, but the crowded streets felt like a prison, every slammed door sending him diving for cover, every celebration firecracker bringing him back to those 3 days in July. The mountains had been his salvation, their vast silence a balm for shattered nerves, their harsh demands leaving no time for haunting memories. He'd built this cabin with his own hands 6 years ago, learning through trial and error. The first winter, snow had leaked through the roof. The second, a bear had torn through his food cache. But each challenge had been a gift in its way, forcing him to focus on immediate survival rather than past horrors. Now the cabin was as solid as he could make it. Neat rows of split wood lined the north wall, enough to last through spring. The root cellar held preserves and dried meat. His rifle, cleaned daily and kept loaded, hung within easy reach above the door. He needed nothing from the world beyond his mountain, and the world, he'd thought, needed nothing from him. The medal slipped from his fingers, landing on the rough-hewn table with a dull clank. James moved to the fireplace, adding another log to the flames. The storm was the worst he'd seen since settling here, the wind finding every tiny gap in the chinking between logs. He'd need to check the livestock again before full dark. His mule and 2 horses were already tucked safely in the barn, but weather like this made him restless. The animals sensed it too. He could hear them shuffling in their stalls, responding to some primitive instinct that warned of danger. The wolves had been growing bolder. Just yesterday, he'd found tracks circling the barn, and the week before, he'd had to shoot one that got too close to his youngest mare. The pack would be hunting tonight, driven by hunger to take risks they'd normally avoid. James pulled on his heavy coat, checking the priming on his rifle more from habit than conscious thought. The military precision of his movements remained, drilled into him by years of service. Some habits, like some memories, never truly faded. Outside, the bitter wind stole his breath. The path to the barn, worn smooth by daily use, had already disappeared under fresh snow. He moved carefully, counting his steps, aware that a single misstep in this weather could prove fatal. 15 paces to the barn door, then he stopped. There, almost lost in the storm's howl, came a sound that didn't belong, a horse's whinny, but not from his barn. Somewhere out in the whiteness, someone was trying to survive this killing storm. James stood motionless, straining his senses, the way he'd done on patrol. The sound came again, closer now, accompanied by something else, the desperate cry of a human voice. Female, young. His first instinct was to retreat into his cabin, to maintain the solitude he'd built so carefully. He'd chosen this life of isolation for good reasons. The last thing he needed was a stranger bringing the outside world to his door. But even as these thoughts crossed his mind, his body was already moving toward the sound. The old instincts, the ones that had kept him and his men alive through the war, took over. Someone was in trouble. Nothing else mattered. He raised his lantern high, its light creating a small circle of visibility in the swirling snow. "This way," he called, his voice rough from disuse. "Head toward the light." The wind snatched his words away, but he called again and again. The sounds were definitely closer now. Through the curtain of white, a shape began to emerge, a horse and rider moving slowly, almost blindly toward his light. James Cooper, who had spent 6 years ensuring he would never again be responsible for another human life, found himself walking out into the storm. The rider's fate was now tied to his, whether he wanted it or not. Some decisions, he realized, were made not by choice, but by circumstance, and by the person you couldn't help but be, no matter how far you ran. Sarah could barely feel her hands on the reins when she finally reached the cabin's door. The light she'd followed emerged from a frost-covered window, and behind it stood a tall figure, lantern raised. Chester stamped nervously, steam rising from his flanks. "Ma'am." The man's voice was rough, unused. He stepped forward, revealing a weathered face partially hidden by a dark beard. "Let's get your horse settled first." Sarah tried to respond, but her teeth chattered too hard to form words. She nodded instead, attempting to dismount. Her legs, numb from cold, betrayed her. She would have fallen if the stranger hadn't moved, with surprising quickness to catch her arm. "Easy now," he said, his grip firm but careful. "The barn's just 20 paces. Can you walk?" Yes." She forced the word out, willing her frozen limbs to cooperate. The man kept one hand under her elbow as he led Chester toward a dark shape that gradually revealed itself to be a small barn. Inside, the wind's howl diminished to a distant roar. The familiar smell of hay and horses filled the space, and Sarah could make out 2 other horses and a mule in their stalls. Her host worked quickly, efficiently, removing Chester's tack and rubbing him down with practiced movements. "Your horse is half frozen," he commented, his tone neutral. "Lucky you found shelter when you did." "The wagon," Sarah began, then swayed as a wave of dizziness washed over her. The man glanced at her sharply. "Wagon talk can wait. You need to get warm." He reached into a wooden chest, pulling out something dark and soft, a wool blanket, she realized, as he wrapped it around her shoulders. The fabric carried the musty smell of storage, but it was clean and thick. "I'm Sarah Winters," she managed, clutching the blanket, "the schoolteacher from Blackhorn Valley." He paused in his work, studying her for a moment. "James Cooper." The introduction seemed to cost him some effort. "My cabin's not fit for company, but it's better than freezing to death." They crossed the short distance to the cabin, James breaking trail through the deepening snow. Sarah stumbled. Twice, her skirts heavy with ice. Each time, his hand appeared at her elbow, steadying her without comment. The cabin's interior struck her first as impossibly bright after the storm's darkness, then as impossibly sparse. A fire burned in a stone fireplace, and a simple wooden table with 2 chairs stood nearby. A narrow bed occupied one corner, its blankets military neat. Everything was clean, ordered, and utterly masculine. "Sit," James directed, pulling one chair closer to the fire. "I'll make coffee." Sarah sank into the chair, still wrapped in the wool blanket. She watched through half-frozen lashes as he moved around the small space, his actions precise and economical. There was something both reassuring and unnerving about his efficiency. "Sugar?" he asked, setting a tin cup before her. "No, thank you." She tried to wrap her fingers around the cup's warmth, but they trembled too badly. Without comment, James steadied the cup, helping her take that first blessed sip of hot coffee. "There's stew," he said after a moment. "You should eat something. I couldn't impose. It's not imposition, it's sense. You're suffering from cold. Hot food and drink will help." His tone made it clear this wasn't a discussion. As feeling slowly returned to her extremities, Sarah became acutely aware of the situation. Here she was, alone in a strange man's cabin, miles from anywhere. If her mother could see her now, she'd faint dead away. Yet there was something about James Cooper's careful distance, the way he moved around her like she was a spooked horse, that paradoxically made her feel safer. This was a man, she sensed, who had thought through every aspect of survival, including now hers. "Thank you," she said softly, when she could trust her voice. "I know this must be an unwelcome interruption to your solitude." James looked up from stirring the stew pot, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "No one plans to be out in weather like this. Even wolves seek shelter on such nights." He hesitated, then added, "The storm's far from over. You'll have to stay until morning at least." The implications of that statement hung in the air between them, as heavy as the wool blanket around her shoulders. Sarah squared her shoulders under its weight. She had chosen the frontier life, with all its uncertainties. Now she would have to trust that this stranger's gruff kindness was exactly what it appeared to be. The cast-iron stove dominated the cabin's main room, its black surface reflecting the firelight like a living thing. James moved around it with the familiarity of long habit, adding wood through its small door, adjusting the damper with practiced touches. The stew pot bubbled on its surface, filling the cabin with the rich aroma of beef and herbs. Sarah watched him work, noting how he kept a careful distance between them, never turning his back completely. A soldier's habits, she realized, remembering the precision of his movements in the barn. The war might be 12 years past, but it still shaped his every action. "Your clothes should dry here," he said, indicating a line strung near the stove. "I can step outside while you change into—" He paused, frowning, then disappeared behind a rough curtain that separated the cabin's sleeping area. He returned with a clean flannel shirt and wool trousers, both clearly his own. "They'll be too big, but they're dry." The thought of wearing a man's clothing should have scandalized her. Instead, Sarah felt only gratitude for the prospect of warmth. "Thank you. I won't need you to step outside. Behind the curtain will be sufficient." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Practical of you. Call if you need help." Behind the curtain, Sarah peeled off her frozen layers, hanging each piece carefully on the line. The borrowed clothing swallowed her. She had to roll the sleeves and pant legs several times, but the fabric held the faint scent of pine smoke and saddle soap, clean and oddly comforting. When she emerged, James was ladling stew into 2 bowls. He glanced up, and something flickered in his expression before he quickly looked away. "Better? Much?" She settled back in her chair, accepting the bowl he offered. The stew was simple but well seasoned, the meat tender. "This is delicious. Did you hunt the beef yourself?" "Venison," he corrected. "From last month's hunting. The vegetables are from my root cellar." They ate in silence for a while, but it was a different quality of silence than before, less awkward, more companionable. The storm's fury seemed to intensify the comfort of the cabin's warmth, the satisfaction of hot food. "How long have you lived here?" Sarah asked finally, when her bowl was nearly empty. James considered the question as if calculating something precisely. 6 years, 4 months. Since the summer of '69. Alone all that time? Mostly. Traders come through every few months. Sometimes I guide hunting parties when they're fool enough to try these mountains. He stood, taking their empty bowls to a wash basin. "You're the first person to stay the night." The implications of that statement hung in the air. Sarah wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, choosing her next words carefully. "I appreciate your hospitality, Mr. Cooper. I know it can't be easy, having your solitude disrupted." "James," he said quietly, still facing the basin, "if you're wearing my clothes and eating my food, you might as well use my given name." "James," she repeated, and saw his shoulders relax slightly. "Then you must call me Sarah." He turned then, leaning against the rough wall. The firelight carved deep shadows in his face, making him look older than she'd first thought. Perhaps 35 or 40. "Sarah, what brought you out in weather like this?" She told him about the school, the monthly wage run to Preston's Crossing, the broken wagon axle. He listened without interrupting, but she noticed how he tensed at her mention of the wolves. "You were lucky," he said when she finished. Another hour out there. He left the sentence unfinished, moving to check the stove's damper again. I know. Sarah watched him add another log, noting how the flames cast his shadow large against the cabin wall. Does it make you uncomfortable having saved me? The question surprised them both. James straightened slowly, meeting her eyes for the first time since she'd changed clothes. Not uncomfortable, just, he searched for the word, responsible. For your safety, until the storm passes. I can take care of myself, she said, but without heat. I'm sure you can. But tonight, you don't have to. He turned back to the stove, ending the conversation as definitively as closing a door. The photograph fell from between the pages of Sarah's book when she reached for it in her carpet bag. It fluttered to the floor like a wounded bird, landing face up near James's feet. He bent to retrieve it, then paused, his hand hovering over the image. A family stood posed before a grand Boston house, father in a dark suit, mother seated in a silk gown, 3 daughters arranged like carefully placed flowers. Sarah recognized herself in the youngest, barely 17 then, wearing the same determined expression she now saw in her mirror. Your family? James asked, handling the photograph with unexpected gentleness before passing it back. Yes, taken the summer before my older sister Mary's wedding. Sarah traced the outline of her sister's figure with one finger. She died 2 years later. Influenza. James nodded, a gesture of understanding rather than mere sympathy. Lost my brother at Antietam. Never found his body. The admission seemed to surprise him, as if he hadn't meant to share so much. He turned abruptly toward his trunk, opened it with decisive movements, and withdrew something wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was another photograph, this one creased and worn at the edges. Thomas, he said, showing her the image of a young man, in uniform, his face bearing the same strong features as James. He was 19, still writing poetry in his letters home the week before the battle. Sarah studied the photograph, noting the confident smile of someone who hadn't yet learned what war really meant. You were there too? Different regiment. I was with the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry. Didn't know he'd fallen until 3 days later. James carefully rewrapped the photograph. That's when I learned that sometimes the waiting and wondering hurts. Worse than knowing. Is that why you came here? To stop waiting and wondering about things you couldn't change? The question hung in the air between them. James moved to the stove, adding another log, though it wasn't strictly needed. Partly. After the war, everything felt too close, too loud, too many people asking if I was all right when they could see I wasn't. Sarah thought of her own family's well-meaning concerns, their constant suggestions about suitable marriages and proper positions. Sometimes other people's care can feel like a cage. Exactly. He turned to face her, surprise and recognition mingled in his expression. You understand that? Why do you think I came out here? Every sympathy call after Mary's death, every careful introduction to eligible young men, they were all bars in that cage. Teaching was my escape. Though I doubt my family would appreciate the comparison. A log shifted in the stove, sending up a shower of sparks. James watched them fade before speaking again. Your parents? They're still living. Yes. Father's a shipping merchant in Boston. Mother spends her days organizing charitable committees and worrying about my spinsterhood. Sarah smiled slightly. They write every month, asking when I'll come to my senses and come home. And will you? No. The certainty in her voice drew his eyes to hers. I have a real purpose here. Those children in the valley, some of them had never held a book. Before I came, last week, little Annie Drake read her first complete sentence. The look on her face. She shook her head. You can't put a price on that kind of moment. James sat in the chair opposite her, his customary guardedness softened by something like recognition. I understand. There's a clarity here. Every day has its purpose. Split wood, tend animals, hunt food, simple things, but real. No pretense, Sarah agreed. No social calls or elaborate demonstrations of status. Just honest work and genuine connections." "Connections?" His tone held a gentle challenge. "I thought I was the only person for 20 miles. And yet you opened your door to a stranger in a storm." She met his gaze steadily. "That seems like a pretty genuine connection to me." The cabin fell quiet, except for the crack and hiss of burning wood. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but in here, something had shifted. The silence between them felt different now. Not the awkward quiet of strangers, but the comfortable pause of two people who had found unexpected common ground. Finally, James spoke softly. "I suppose even a hermit can surprise himself sometimes." "Life has a way of sending us what we need," Sarah replied, "even when it's not what we thought we wanted." His eyes met hers across the warm space, and for a moment neither looked away. The dented coffee tin caught the firelight as James reached for it again. "More?" he offered, and Sarah nodded, holding out her cup. The hour was late. The cabin's single clock had chimed 11 some time ago, but neither seemed inclined towards sleep. "It's good coffee," she said, watching as he carefully measured the grounds. "Much better than what we get at the general store. Trade with the Mexican merchants when they come through. They understand coffee better than most." He worked the pot with practiced movements. "Learned to appreciate good coffee during the war. Sometimes it was the only thing that kept us moving." "What was it like?" Sarah asked softly. "The war? No one ever speaks of it back home, except in grand terms of victory and sacrifice." James was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if reading from a book written long ago. "Mostly, I remember the waiting. Hours of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror, the smell of wet wool and gunpowder, the way men prayed in whispers the night before a battle." He poured fresh coffee for them both, the rich aroma filling. "The cabin. But there were good moments too, sharing letters from home, singing around campfires, the way men from different worlds became brothers. Like your cavalry unit." "Yeah." He smiled slightly. "Had a Boston boy in my squadron, Harvard-educated, never worked a day in his life. By the end of the war, he could shoe a horse better than any blacksmith I knew." Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "What happened to him?" "Went back. To Boston. Became a doctor. Writes me sometimes, though I rarely answer." James stared into his coffee. "It's harder to maintain friendships when you're running away from the world." "Is that what you're doing? Running away?" He met her eyes then, something vulnerable crossing his expression. "Aren't you?" "Perhaps," she admitted. "But I like to think I'm running towards something too. Independence, purpose, a life that's truly my own." "And have you found it? Out here in the wilderness?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Parts of it. Teaching gives me purpose. The children's progress gives me joy. But sometimes—" She paused, surprised by her own honesty. "Sometimes the silence is very loud." James nodded slowly. "I know that silence. It's different from solitude." "How do you bear it?" "Work helps. Physical labor leaves little room for loneliness." He gestured around the cabin. "Built most of this myself. Every log, every nail was a lesson in focus. And when the work is done, when night falls, then I remember why I chose this life. The simplicity, the peace." He hesitated. "Though tonight has made me wonder if I've taken simplicity too far." Sarah felt her cheeks warm, not entirely from the coffee. "How so?" "Having someone to talk to. It's not as difficult as I remembered." His voice dropped lower. "At least, not with the right person." The coffee pot simmered quietly on the stove, marking the silence that followed his words. Sarah found herself studying his face in the dim light, the stern lines softened by firelight, the grey threading his dark beard, the way his eyes seemed to hold both caution and invitation. "I should check the horses," he said, suddenly standing. "At this hour. Storm makes them restless. Won't be able to sleep anyway until I know they're settled." He pulled on his coat. "Will you be all right for a few minutes?" Sarah smiled. "I think I can manage not to burn down your cabin in the time it takes to check the barn." That earned her a quick grin, transforming his face. "I appreciate the consideration." He paused at the door. "There's more coffee in the tin if you want." After he left, Sarah stood and walked slowly around the cabin, really looking at it for the first time. Everything spoke of careful craftsmanship. The tight-fitted logs, the smooth planed table, the sturdy shelves lined with books. This wasn't the home of a man running from life, she realized, but one who had built a life on his own terms. She ran her fingers along the spines of his books: Milton, Wordsworth, tactical manuals, practical guides to farming and hunting. A copy of Thoreau's Walden showed signs of frequent reading, not a hermit's library, but a philosopher's. The door opened, bringing a burst of cold air and James's tall figure. He stamped snow from his boots, then stopped, seeing her by his bookshelf. Their eyes met in the lantern light, and Sarah suddenly understood that they were both facing a choice, not just about tonight or tomorrow, but about what kind of silence they wanted in their lives. The cabin window rattled in its frame as another gust of wind struck, making Sarah jump. The glass, clouded with frost at its edges, offered only darkness beyond its pain. James stood beside it, his expression tense as he studied the night. "Storms, getting worse," he said quietly. "The kind that can last for days." Sarah moved to stand beside him, drawn by the concern in his voice. Through the window she could see snow whipping past in horizontal sheets, the barn barely visible as a darker shape in the swirling white. "I've never seen anything like it." "Worst storm since '71, James replied. "Lost 2 good horses that year. Couldn't reach the barn for 3 days. His hand rested on the window frame, fingers tracing old wood. "This time we're better prepared." But a long, mournful howl cut through the storm's roar, closer than before. Sarah felt James stiffen beside her, his body automatically shifting to place himself between her and the window. "The wolves," she whispered. "They're hunting. They've been watching the barn since sunset." His voice was grim. "Storms driving them down from the high country. They're desperate enough to risk coming this close." Another howl, answered by several others. The pack was coordinating, surrounding the cabin and barn. Sarah thought of Chester in his stall and James's horses. "Will the barn hold?" "It's solid. Double-thick doors, reinforced with iron." He turned from the window, checking his rifle for the 3rd time in an hour. But a desperate wolf can chew through most anything given time. Thunder cracked overhead, startlingly loud. Sarah flinched and found herself closer to James than she'd intended. He didn't step away. "You should try to rest," he said, his voice softer than before. "Take the bed. I'll keep watch." "I couldn't possibly sleep," she protested. "Not with all this." "Then we'll both keep watch." He moved to the stove, adding more wood. "But you should at least sit. No sense in standing all night." They settled into the chairs by the fire, but Sarah noticed James had positioned himself with clear lines of sight to both window and door. The soldier in him never truly rested, she realized. The storm pressed against the cabin like a living thing, seeking entry. Every crack and seam whispered with infiltrating wind, despite the careful chinking between logs. The walls creaked under the assault, the whole structure seeming to huddle against the onslaught. "Tell me about Boston," James said suddenly. When she looked at him questioningly, he added, "Talk helps, makes the storm feel less overwhelming," she offered. "Something like that." So she told him about summer concerts in the public garden, about sailing in the harbor with her father, about the way fog rolled in from the sea on autumn mornings. She described the Christmas ball she'd attended, the elaborate dresses and carefully practiced dances, aware now of how foreign it all must sound in this frontier cabin. "You must miss it sometimes," he said when she finished. "Parts of it," she admitted. "But it feels like a different life now, a different person." She smiled slightly, though I doubt that person ever imagined she'd spend a night like this, wearing borrowed men's clothing in a mountain cabin. "Life has a way of surprising us," James said, echoing her words from earlier, sometimes even pleasantly. The wind howled again, but this time it felt less threatening. Inside the cabin, the space between their chairs had somehow diminished, though neither remembered moving. I should check the fire in the barn, James said, standing reluctantly. The animals will need the warmth. I'll come with you. When he started to protest, she added, 2 sets of eyes are better than 1, and I'd rather face whatever's out there than sit here imagining it. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Stay close, and if I say run, I won't leave the horses. Sarah, his voice was firm, if I say run, you run. The horses aren't worth your life. Their eyes met in the lamplight. A silent battle of wills. Finally, she nodded. All right, but the same goes for you. No heroics. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. Yes, ma'am. He reached for their coats, helping her with hers before taking up the rifle. Ready? Sarah took a deep breath, steeling. One last glance at the frost-covered window that separated them from the storm's fury. Ready! The Winchester rifle felt solid in James's hands as they stepped out into the storm. Sarah stayed close behind him, one hand gripping the back of his coat. The 20 paces to the barn had become a treacherous journey through knee-deep snow and howling wind. They were halfway there when James stopped abruptly. Sarah collided with his back, then froze as she saw what had halted him. 3 dark shapes moved through the swirling snow, low to the ground, eyes reflecting the lantern's light like yellow coins. Back to the cabin, James said quietly. Slow and steady. But before they could retreat, more shapes emerged from the white darkness behind them. The pack had them surrounded, using the storm as cover for their approach. Sarah counted 6 wolves, then 8, their hunger overwhelming their natural fear of humans. The barn, James amended, his voice still calm. It's closer. Move with me. They changed direction, maintaining a measured pace. James kept the rifle moving in a slow arc, covering their flanks. The wolves paced them, drawing gradually closer. One bold male darted forward, testing their defenses. The Winchester's report cracked through the storm. The wolf yelped and leaped back, wounded but not fatally. The shot's echo had barely faded. Before the pack responded, their howls triumphant now that they had their quarry in the open. "Run!" James commanded, and they sprinted the remaining distance to the barn. The wolves surged forward, but another shot from the Winchester held them. At bay long enough for Sarah to wrench open the door. They tumbled inside, and James slammed the heavy door shut just as something massive crashed against it. The horses whinnied in terror, stamping in their stalls. Chester's scared breathing was harsh in the enclosed space. Sarah moved quickly to calm them, while James secured the door's iron bar. "Will it hold?" she asked, stroking Chester's neck. "It'll hold." James checked his ammunition. "But they're not going to just go away. Not now that they've got our scent and know where we are." As if confirming his words, they could hear scratching at the walls, the sound of powerful jaws testing the wood. The pack had them surrounded, and they knew it. "We can't stay here until they give up," Sarah said. "The horses will panic and we'll freeze once the fire dies." James nodded, reloading the Winchester with practiced efficiency. "We need to make it back to the cabin. I have more ammunition there, and better sight lines for shooting." How many rounds do you have now?" 4 in the rifle, 2 in my pocket." He smiled grimly. "Not enough for the whole pack." Sarah looked around the barn, mind working. What if we created a diversion? Something to draw them away long enough for us to reach the cabin? James studied her face in the lantern light. "What are you thinking?" "The hay bales. If we could get one outside, away from the barn." She didn't need to finish. James was already nodding. Fire would draw them. They fear it, but they'd have to investigate. He considered the logistics. "We could push a bale out the back window, light it from inside. When they go to check it out, we make a run for the cabin." Their eyes met, sharing a moment of perfect understanding. Without further discussion, they began preparing. James helped Sarah climb into the hayloft, passing her the lantern while he manhandled a bale toward the small window. "Ready?" he asked, one hand on the window latch. Sarah held up the lantern. "Ready." The window opened with a blast of Arctic air. Together they pushed the hay bale out into the snow. Sarah held the lantern to it, and the dry stalks caught quickly despite the storm. Within moments, flames were leaping skyward. creating a bright beacon in the darkness. The wolves' reaction was immediate. Their scratching at the barn walls ceased, replaced by uncertain growls. Through the window, Sarah could see dark shapes moving toward the fire, drawn by its unnatural presence. "Now," James said softly, "stay close to me. If we get separated, don't stop running until you reach the cabin." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. As James reached for the door's bar, she touched his arm. "James?" He turned, and she quickly pressed her lips to his cheek, surprising them. "Both, for luck," she whispered. In the lantern's glow, she saw his expression soften for just a moment. Then he lifted the bar, and together they stepped out to face whatever waited in the storm. The first light of dawn transformed the cabin's frost-covered windows into sheets of diamonds. Sarah stood before one, watching the ice crystals catch fire with morning's glow. Their mad dash from the barn had succeeded, barely. Now, as the storm began to ease, the night's events felt almost dreamlike. "Coffee?" James's voice was rough with fatigue. He hadn't slept, keeping watch through the remaining dark hours while Sarah had dozed fitfully in the chair. "Please." She turned from the window, studying him in the strengthening light. A scratch on his cheek had dried to a thin red line, earned when one of the wolves had come too close during their sprint to safety. The sight of it made her heart clench. He worked the coffee pot with his usual precision, though she noticed a slight tremor in his hands. "The pack moved on about an hour ago. Probably headed down to the valley to look for easier prey." "The barn?" "Checked it at first light. No serious damage. Your horse is fine, just spooked." He poured coffee for them both, then joined her at the window. "You handled yourself well out there." Coming from him, it felt like high praise. "I had a good teacher. The way you stayed calm, knew exactly what to do. Experience." He sipped, his coffee, eyes distant. "Though I have to admit, firing over wolf packs wasn't covered in cavalry training." "No, I suppose not." Sarah watched a chunk of ice fall from the eaves, shattering in the morning light. "What you said last night, about life surprising us, I think I understand better now." James turned to look at her, his expression softening. "How so?" "When I left Boston, I thought I was ready for anything. I'd read about frontier life, prepared myself for hard work and isolation. But last night," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "Last night taught me that sometimes our greatest challenges come with unexpected gifts." "Gifts?" His voice was quiet. "Partnership, trust, the discovery that we're stronger than we imagined." She met his eyes. "The realization that sometimes letting someone in doesn't make us weaker." The silence between them held none of the awkwardness of the previous day. James set his coffee cup down, his movements deliberate. "I've spent 6 years learning to need no one. Built these walls, literally and figuratively, to keep the world at a safe distance. And now I'm wondering if I built them too well?" He touched the scratch on his cheek absently. "If I've been confusing safety with solitude." Sarah's and rose of its own accord, fingers brushing his where they rested on his face. He caught her hand gently, holding it there for a moment before letting go. "We should check the horses," he said, but made no move toward the door. "Make sure they've settled after the excitement." "Of course." She smiled slightly. "Though I notice you're saying we now, not telling me to stay behind." That earned her a quiet chuckle. "After watching you face down a wolf pack with nothing but a lantern and quick thinking, I'd be a fool to underestimate you again." They dressed for the cold, movements synchronized now from shared experience. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed world. Every branch wore a coating of ice that sparkled in the morning sun. Their breath formed clouds in the crystalline air as they made their way to the barn. Inside, the horses nickered greetings. Jester pressed his nose against Sarah's shoulder as she checked him over, while James's mare stretched her neck over the stall partition, seeking his attention. "No worse for wear," James assessed, running practiced hands over his horse's legs. "Though I think we'll all sleep better tonight." "Tonight," Sarah repeated softly. They hadn't discussed how long she would stay, how long the snow would keep the trails impassable. The subject hung between them, unspoken, but impossible to ignore. "The path to Blackhorn Valley won't be clear for at least a week," James said, as if reading her thoughts. "Maybe longer with this much snow. I should send word to the school board, let them know I'm safe." She hesitated. "If you have paper, I could write a note. Perhaps next time you go hunting. I'll make sure it reaches them." He turned to face her fully. "Sarah, about last night." "Yes?" But whatever he'd been about to say was interrupted by a sharp crack from outside, another sheet of ice falling from the roof. The moment passed, yet something had shifted between them, as tangible as the changing light through the barn's high windows. They finished tending the horses in comfortable silence, then stepped out into the brilliant morning. The world sparkled. Around them, familiar yet somehow new, like a painting seen in different light. 3 days after the storm, James brought Sarah's broken wagon wheel into his workshop, a lean-to attached to the barn's southern wall. The oak was split clean through beyond simple repair, but he laid it out on his workbench anyway, studying the break with careful attention. "I can remake it," he said, running his fingers along the splintered wood. "Have some seasoned oak put aside for winter projects. Won't be as fancy as the original, but it'll be stronger." Sarah watched him work, admiring the sure movements of his hands as he took measurements. The past few days had settled into an unexpected rhythm, sharing meals, tending animals, evening conversations that stretched later each night. Now, watching him plan her wagon's repair, she felt oddly conflicted. "There's no hurry," she said. "The pass won't be clear for days yet." James glanced up, his expression unreadable. "No, it won't. But best to be prepared." He selected a piece of oak from his stock, hefting its weight. "Your school board will be wondering about you. I wrote the note, as we discussed. Whenever you next go hunting." "About that." He set the wood down, turning to face her fully. "I've been thinking, once the wheel's fixed, and the weather allows, I should escort you back to Blackhorn Valley. These mountains can be treacherous after a big snow. Easy to lose the trail where drifts have covered it." Something warmed in Sarah's chest at his offer, even as practicality made her protest. "I couldn't ask you to leave your animals, your routine. You're not asking, I'm offering." He picked up a plane, testing its edge. "Besides, I need supplies from Preston's Crossing. Make the trip worthwhile." They both knew it for the excuse it was, but neither commented on it. Sarah moved closer, watching as he began shaping the new wheel spoke. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle from years of such work. A dusting of sawdust had settled in his beard. "I've been thinking too," she said carefully, "about ways to repay your hospitality. Not necessary." "Nevertheless," she persisted, "the school board pays me partly in supplies, flour, coffee, sugar. I could share some, help replenish what we've used." "We?" The word hung in the air between them. "These past few days." She paused, gathering courage. "I've never felt more at home anywhere, not even in Boston." James set down his tools slowly. "Sarah, I know it's forward of me to say so. I know it goes against every rule of propriety. But after what we faced together, it seems foolish to pretend this is just about hospitality or practical matters." He turned to face her, sawdust floating in the shaft of sunlight between them. "No, it's not just about hospitality, but you have a life in Blackhorn Valley, students who need you, a position to maintain. The school is 15 miles from here, far but not impossible, especially if," she hesitated, if I had a reason to make the journey, if there was somewhere, someone, to come home." 2. James stood very still, the morning light carving deep shadows in his face. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "I'm not an easy man to live with. These years alone have left their mark. I'm not asking for easy. I'm asking for real." She stepped closer, close enough to see the pulse beating in his throat. "Unless I'm misreading everything that's happened since that first night." His hand rose to cup her cheek, calloused palm gentle against her skin. "No, you're not misreading anything." He took a deep breath. But there would be talk. A respectable schoolteacher, living so far out, with a man who left civilization behind. Let them talk. I didn't come west for other people's opinions. She covered his hand with hers. I came to build something meaningful, something true. The kiss, when it came, tasted of sawdust and coffee and possibility. James's arms wrapped around her with careful strength, as if she might disappear like morning mist. When they finally parted, his eyes held a light she hadn't seen before. "The wheel can wait," he said softly. "For now." Sarah smiled, understanding all he wasn't saying. They had time now, time to figure out how two independent souls could build a life together without either losing their hard-won freedom. Time to learn each other's rhythms, to make plans, to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Outside the workshop, snow was already beginning to melt from the cabin's eaves, the first sign of winter's loosening grip. But inside, surrounded by the scent of fresh-cut oak and the warmth of newfound purpose, Sarah and James had found their own kind of spring. A week after the storm, Hank Matthews' arrival broke their peaceful isolation. The grizzled trapper appeared at the cabin door just before noon, his mule laden with furs and news from town. James invited him in with quiet courtesy, though Sarah noticed how he positioned himself between her and their visitor. "Whole town's been wondering about you, Miss Winters," Hank said, warming his hands by the stove. "School board posted notices all over Preston's Crossing when you didn't show up that storm night. Search parties were forming till the second blizzard hit." Sarah felt James tense beside her. The notice board in Preston's Crossing served as the community's nerve center. Marriages, deaths, missing persons, all posted for public scrutiny. The thought of her name there, subject to speculation and gossip, made her stomach tighten. "I hope nobody risked themselves searching," she said carefully. "Nah, weather was too fierce, but folks been talking." Hank's shrewd eyes moved between them. "Reverend Mills, especially. Been saying prayers for your safety every Sunday." James poured coffee for their visitor, his movements deliberately calm. "The school board got my note yesterday. About Miss Winters being safe here?" "Aye. Your hunting partner Pete delivered it. Caused quite a stir, I hear." Hank accepted the coffee with a nod. "Some folks wondered why you didn't bring the lady teacher straight back to town." "The pass has been impassable," Sarah said firmly. "Mr. Cooper has been kind enough to offer shelter until the way clears." "Kind indeed," Hank murmured into his coffee cup. "Though some might say too kind, if you take my meaning." James set his own cup down with careful precision. "I take your meaning, Hank, and I'll thank you to remember you're speaking of a lady." The trapper raised his hands in peaceful gesture. "No offense meant, just passing along what's being said. Figure you'd want to know given how folks can talk." Sarah squared her shoulders. "And what exactly are they saying, Mr. Matthews?" "Well, ma'am, some are questioning whether it's proper for an unmarried lady to be staying so long with a bachelor, even one as respected as James here." He glanced apologetically at them both. "Reverend Mills particularly seemed concerned about your reputation." "My reputation," Sarah repeated softly. "And do these concerned citizens have an alternative suggestion? Should I have frozen to death instead?" "Sarah," James warned quietly, but she pressed on. "I survived a blizzard, Mr. Matthews. Wolves, too, thanks to Mr. Cooper's skill and generosity. If the good people of Preston's Crossing wish to question and that generosity, perhaps they should ask themselves what they would have done in his place." Hank studied her with new respect. "You've got spirit, Miss Winters, I'll give you that. Might be enough to weather what's coming." He turned to James. "Pete said to tell you he's holding mail for you in town. Seems there's a letter from Boston." Sarah felt her heart skip. A letter from Boston meant her parents had learned of her situation. Their reaction was all too easy to imagine. Her mother's hysteria, her father's stern disapproval. The pass should be clear enough for travel. "By week's end," James said, his voice neutral. "I'll collect the mail then." After Hank left, silence filled the cabin. Sarah stood at the window, watching the trapper's mule pick its way down the snowy path. James came to stand behind her, not touching but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "We knew this would come," he said quietly. "Yes." She turned to face him. "But knowing doesn't make it easier." "No." His eyes held hers steadily. "What do you want to do?" The question carried weight beyond the immediate situation. Sarah thought of the notice board in town, of Reverend Mill's prayers, of her parents' waiting letter. Then she thought of the past week, of quiet mornings and shared work, of evening conversations and growing trust. "I want to face it," she said firmly. "All of it. But I won't let other people's opinions drive me from what I know is right." James nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something for him. "Then we'll face it together, when the past clears." The word "together" hung between them like a promise, more binding than any posted notice could ever be. The letter from Boston sat unopened on James's table, her father's precise handwriting stark against the cream envelope. Sarah had been staring at it for nearly an hour, while James worked quietly outside, giving her privacy for what they both knew would be a difficult reading. Finally, she broke the seal, unfolding 3 sheets of expensive stationery covered in her father's firm hand. "My dear daughter, news of your predicament has reached us through the telegraph office in Preston's Crossing. Your mother has taken to her bed with anxiety, and I find myself questioning every decision that led to allowing this Western adventure of yours. I have made arrangements with the Appleton family. Richard still holds you in highest regard, despite your previous refusal of his suit. He has agreed to forget that unfortunate episode and would welcome you as his bride upon your return to Boston. This solution would restore your reputation and provide you the security you have so recklessly endangered. A draft for your travel. Expenses is enclosed. Telegraph upon reaching any major station, and we will send someone to escort you home. Your concerned father." Sarah set the letter down with trembling hands. The draft fluttered to the floor, but she made no move to retrieve it. Outside, she could hear James splitting wood, the steady rhythm of axe against log matching her heartbeat. The door opened quietly, and he entered, reading her expression. Without a word, he poured them both coffee and sat across from her, waiting. "They want me to come home," she said finally, "to marry Richard Appleton and forget this Western adventure, as father calls it." James nodded slowly, his face carefully neutral. "Appleton? You've mentioned him before." "My mother's choice. He has a shipping business like father, lives in a fine house on Beacon Hill." She traced the letter's edge with one finger. "Everything a proper Boston lady could want. Is that what you want?" "I wanted it once, or thought. I did." She met his eyes. "It seems like another lifetime now. Before I knew what it was to build something real, to face real challenges, to feel—" "What?" "Alive." She stood, moving to the window. "Richard Appleton has never split wood or faced down wolves or helped birth a calf in the middle of the night. He's never taught a child to read or watch the sun rise over mountains or—" She turned back to James. "Or looked at me the way you do." He stood then, crossing to her with the quiet grace that still surprised her in such a powerful man. "And how do I look at you? Like you see me. The real me. Not just the proper Boston lady I was raised to be." His hand rose to cup her cheek, rough with calluses but infinitely gentle. "I see a woman of remarkable courage and determination. Someone who chose a harder path because it was true to her heart. And now I have to choose again." She leaned into his touch. "They'll never understand, you know. My parents, the Boston society they represent. They'll say I've ruined myself. You don't have to decide right now, don't I?" She stepped back, gesturing at the letter. "They're waiting for my telegraph. The whole town is watching and wondering. Even the Reverend is praying for my soul. At some point, we have to face what this means." James was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those deep eyes that seemed to see everything. "When I came to these mountains," he said finally, "I thought I was choosing solitude, choosing to leave the world and its judgments behind. But now I wonder if I wasn't really waiting for someone strong enough to choose this life, not just accept it, but choose it. Are you asking me to choose you? I'm asking you to choose yourself, the self you've become out here. He picked up the draft from the floor, holding it out to her. Whatever you decide, know that I respect your right to make that choice. Sarah took the draft, looking at the substantial sum written there. It represented everything she'd left behind: security, propriety, her family's approval. Then she looked at James, at the cabin they'd shared, at the life they could build together. With deliberate movements, she crossed to the stove and opened its door. The draft caught fire immediately, curling into ash in seconds. Her letter from home followed it. "I've made my choice," she said quietly. "Now, we just have to figure out how to live with it." James disappeared into town the day after Sarah burned her letter, returning at dusk with supplies and a small leather pouch he wouldn't discuss. That evening, after their usual shared supper, he seemed unusually restless, checking the fire more often than necessary, and repeatedly touching the pocket of his coat. "Something's on your mind," Sarah said finally, setting aside her mending. "Would you like to share it?" He stood by the fireplace, his broad shoulders tense. "I've been thinking about what you said, about choosing this life, despite what others might say." "Yes. It occurred to me that while we can't control town gossip or your family's opinions, we could give them less to gossip about." He turned to face her, and for the first time since she'd known him, James Cooper looked uncertain. "If you were willing." Sarah's heart began to beat faster, but she kept her voice steady. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" He crossed to where she sat, lowering himself to one knee. From his pocket, he drew the leather pouch and opened it, revealing a simple gold ring. "It was my mother's," he said quietly, "the only thing I kept from before. I've been carrying it all these years, not knowing why until now." Sarah stared at the ring, its surface gleaming softly in the firelight. No diamonds, no elaborate engravings, just a plain band that had witnessed another lasting love. "No, I'm not what your parents hoped for," James continued. "I can't offer you Boston society or fine carriages, but I can offer you honesty, partnership, and a life built on our own terms." He met her eyes steadily. "Will you marry me, Sarah Winters?" She reached out to touch the ring, then his hand holding it. "When?" He blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "When?" "Yes, when would we marry? Tomorrow? Next month? I find I'm rather impatient now that you've asked." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming it. "The circuit preacher comes through Preston's Crossing next week, but Sarah, are you sure this isn't just about the gossip or your family?" "James Cooper," she said firmly, taking his face between her hands. "I burned my ticket home and my family's letter. I've chosen this life, chosen you, with clear eyes and a full heart. So yes, I'm sure." He slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Then he drew her into a kiss that held all the warmth of their shared fireside, all the promise of their shared future. When they parted, Sarah couldn't help laughing softly. "What will Reverend Mills say? After all his prayers for my salvation." "He can keep praying if he likes," James said, settling beside her. "But I think we've found our own kind of salvation, here in these mountains. We'll need witnesses," she mused, "practical even in this moment. And I should write to the school board, let them know my plans." "Already spoken with Pete and his wife," James admitted. "They've agreed to stand up with us, and I may have mentioned the possibility to Hank when he was here. You were that sure of my answer." "Not sure at all, but hoping." He touched the ring on her finger. "Mother would have liked you, you know. She was a practical woman who valued courage over convention." Sarah leaned against him, feeling the solid strength that had first drawn her. "Tell me about her, about your family." So as the fire burned low, James shared stories he hadn't told in years. Of his mother's garden, his father's laugh, his brother's poetry. Sarah listened, understanding that he was giving her not just memories, but the pieces of himself he'd kept locked away for so long. Later, as James walked her to the barn where she still slept for propriety's sake, the night Air cold and clear around them, she paused at the door. 1 week, she said softly. He squeezed her hand. 1 week. Then we build our life together, whatever anyone else might say. Sarah watched him walk back to the cabin, his figure dark against the snow. The ring on her finger caught the moonlight, and she smiled, thinking how the simplest things, a plain gold band, a rough cabin, a love built on respect and understanding, could hold more value than all the fine things she'd left behind in Boston. On the rough-hewn table, James spread out a sheet of paper covered in careful measurements and sketches. The cabin extension plans had occupied his evenings for the past 3 days, each detail considered with the same precision he brought to all his work. "The new room here," he explained, pointing to the eastern wall. "Morning light for reading, plenty of space for your books when they arrive from the schoolhouse, windows facing the valley so you can see the weather coming." Sarah leaned over his shoulder, studying the drawings. "You've thought of everything." "Not everything." He pulled out another sketch. "Thought we might add a proper kitchen here, more storage space, better light for cooking, and a root cellar beneath, bigger than the current one. Planning to feed an army, planning for the future." He glanced up at her. "Pete's wife mentioned you're good with children. The school board's not the only ones who've noticed." A warm flush spread across Sarah's cheeks. They hadn't discussed children yet, but the idea had been there, unspoken, in their plans and preparations. "The cabin will need to grow with us. And then, that's the beauty of building your own home. It can become whatever we need it to be." He traced the lines of the proposed addition. "I've been stockpiling lumber, good seasoned pine. With Pete's help, we could have the framework up before the spring rains." Sarah pulled up a chair, adding her own practical considerations to the plans. "We'll need more shelving here, and perhaps a desk by this window. For grading papers and writing letters, already planned for it." He flipped to another sketch. "Built-in bookshelf along this wall, desk beneath the window. Thought you might like a space of your own for teaching work." The consideration in his planning touched her deeply. This wasn't just a man making room for a wife in his home. This was a true partner, creating space for all aspects of her life and work. "The school board's letter arrived today," she said, pulling the document from her pocket. "They've agreed to my proposal. 3 days of teaching in the valley, with reduced pay, but freedom to arrange my own schedule." James nodded, unsurprised. They'd discussed this possibility at length, how to balance her commitment to teaching with their life together. "The mare I'm training will be ready by spring. Steady on mountain trails, even in poor weather. You've thought of that too. Everything we build here, we build together." He caught her hand, thumb brushing over his mother's ring. "Your work matters. The children in the valley need their teacher, and their teacher needs this." Sarah gestured to the plans, to the cabin around them, to him. "A home that's more than just a place to live. A purpose that's more than just a job." A commotion outside drew their attention. Pete's wagon arriving with the first load of lumber. They stepped out to greet him, and Sarah was struck by how naturally James included their neighbor in their plans, how easily he'd begun to reconnect with the community he'd once shunned. "Brought what I could today," Pete called, jumping down from the wagon. "Rest will come next week after the wedding. Mary's already started on a quilt for you both." "She shouldn't go to the trouble," Sarah protested, but Pete waved her off. "Community takes care of its own," he said simply, "even ones who've kept to themselves too long." He shot a meaningful look at James, who actually smiled. They spent the afternoon unloading lumber, stacking it carefully under tarps near the cabin. Pete's easy conversation and ready laugh filled the space that had been silent for so long, and Sarah watched James gradually relax into the interaction. As the sun began to set, Pete loaded empty crates back into his wagon. "Mary says to remind you, dinner at our place tomorrow, no arguments. She wants to discuss wedding preparations." After he left, Sarah and James stood in the lengthening shadows, surveying the stacked lumber that represented their future. "It's really happening," she said softly. "All of it." "Having second thoughts?" "No." She turned to face him. "I'm having first thoughts. and second thoughts, and third thoughts, and they're all the same. This is right. This is where I'm meant to be. He pulled her close, both of them still smelling of fresh-cut pine and honest work. The cabin plans lay on the table inside, waiting to become reality, just as their shared future waited to unfold before them. The packet of seeds lay open on the newly built kitchen table, tiny promises of life spilling across the smooth wood. Sarah sorted them with careful fingers: peas, carrots, beans and herbs, while James worked the soil in their expanded garden plot. Through the new window, she could see him breaking ground that had never been cultivated, each strike of his hoe revealing dark earth to spring sunshine. The winter's snow had finally retreated, leaving behind soil enriched by months of rest. The south slope gets the best light, he'd explained while planning the garden. Protected from the worst winds, good drainage. Been meaning to plant more than just the basics for years. Now, watching him work the soil where her kitchen herbs would grow, Sarah understood that he'd been waiting for more than just the right time to expand the garden. He'd been waiting for someone to make it worth the effort. Their wedding 2 months ago had changed more than just their living arrangements. The cabin itself had transformed, growing to accommodate their shared life. The new room faced east as planned, filled with morning light and Sarah's books. James had built the shelves himself, sizing them perfectly to hold her teaching materials and beloved volumes. But the real transformation had been in James himself. The solitary man who'd once gone weeks without speaking now discussed plans. Over breakfast, shared stories in the evening, and had even begun accepting dinner invitations from neighbors. Last week, he'd spent an entire afternoon helping Tommy Drake, one of Sarah's students, gentle a wild-spirited colt. "Soil's ready," he called from the garden. "How do you want to arrange the planting?" Sarah gathered the seeds and her carefully drawn garden plan. Outside, the spring air held the last bite of winter, but promised warmth to come. She joined James in the turned earth, showing him her design. "Herbs closest to the kitchen," she explained. "Then peas along the fence you built. They'll need the support for climbing. Carrots and beans in the middle where the soil's deepest." He studied her plan with the same attention he'd given to the cabin extension. "Good thinking. You've allowed space for everything to grow. I had a good teacher." She smiled, remembering their conversations about soil and seasons, about giving plants room to flourish. "Though I never expected to use my Boston Garden Club knowledge quite like this." James looked around at their expanding homestead. The enlarged cabin, the new barn addition, the freshly turned garden. Place keeps growing like it was waiting to become more than just shelter. "It's becoming a home," Sarah said softly, "a real home." They worked together through the morning, planting seeds in careful rows. Sarah showed him how to gauge the proper depth for each type, while he demonstrated how to protect tender shoots from late frost. Their hands met in the soil, dirty and honest and purposeful. As they worked, Sarah's students began arriving for their afternoon lessons. She'd converted the cabin's original room into a classroom 3 days a week, an arrangement that had raised eyebrows but proved practically sound. The children seemed to learn better here than in the drafty valley schoolhouse, and parents had stopped questioning the arrangement when their children's reading and arithmetic showed marked improvement. "Teacher," Annie Drake called, running ahead of her older brothers. "Did you plant the seeds? Can we help?" James straightened from his work, and Sarah saw him hide a smile as the young girl skidded to a stop at the garden's edge. "Careful of the new plantings," he said, his gruff tone belied by the gentleness in his eyes. "But if you want to help, we've got more seeds to sow after lessons." Annie beamed at him, no longer intimidated by the mountain man who'd once seemed so fierce. Other children arrived, gathering at the garden's edge with curious eyes. "First, we learn," Sarah said firmly, brushing soil from her skirts. "Then we plant. Who can tell me why seeds need both soil and sunshine to grow?" As she led her students inside, she caught James watching her with an expression that made her heart warm. Later, they would plant the remaining seeds together, planning for harvests yet to come. But for now she had young minds to tend, another kind of garden that needed nurturing. The seeds of change they'd planted that winter had grown into something. Neither of them had expected, not just a marriage or a home, but a life rich with purpose and possibility. Like the garden taking shape outside their window, it would require care and attention to flourish. But the soil was good, the foundations were strong, and they would tend it together. The wedding quilt spread across their bed, its patterns telling a story in fabric and thread. Mary Peterson and the women of Preston's Crossing had sewn it in secret during those first difficult weeks, each square representing a piece of the community's life. Here was the schoolhouse, stitched in precise lines that Sarah recognized as Annie Drake's mother's work. There, a mountain cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, sewn by Mary herself. Horses, trees, books and flowers. Each square a blessing, a welcome, an acceptance of the unconventional love that had bloomed in winter's darkest hour. "Never seen anything like it," James said, his voice gruff with emotion as he traced the careful stitching. "All this work for us." "For you too," Sarah reminded him gently. "They've just been waiting for you to let them in." The spring wedding had drawn more guests than either expected. Families from the valley, traders who'd known James for years, even Reverend Mills, who'd performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. The same community that had once whispered in concern now celebrated their union with feasting and dance. Pete had stood up as James's witness, while Mary Peterson stood with Sarah. Their wedding supper was a community effort. Wild turkey and fresh bread, preserved fruits and early spring vegetables. Children ran playing between the tables, and Sarah's students presented her with handwritten poems bound in a leather notebook. Now, as evening settled over their expanded cabin, Sarah and James stood together by the new east window. The garden soil lay rich and promising in its neat rows, the first sprouts already reaching for spring sunlight. Inside, their books mingled. On fresh-built shelves, their cups sat paired by the coffee pot, and the wedding quilt crowned their shared bed. "When I first took shelter here," Sarah said softly, "I never imagined this would be my home, that the storm that seemed a disaster would lead me to everything I didn't know I needed." James drew her close, his arms strong and sure around her. "When I built this cabin, I thought I was building a fortress, somewhere to hide from the world." He kissed her temple gently. "Instead, it became a gateway to a bigger life than I ever thought I'd have again." Through the window, they could see the mountains where their story had begun, still touched with winter's snow, but warming to spring's promise. The future stretched before them like the valley below, wide open, full of possibility, and all the more beautiful for being shared. And if the winds still howled sometimes on dark nights, they had each other, and a love as solid as the cabin's new foundations, as warm as the quilt that would cover their dreams.